Hi, my name is Stu Boehmig, and I've spent most of my life trying to understand all of life from God's perspective. And that's why today I'd like to start a series on how to become an overcomer, on God's perspective on how we can overcome the various things that crowd into our lives unexpectedly and overwhelm us. And to do that, I'd like to study the life of one of the greatest people who ever lived. A man who had a sold-out passion for something. And if he were here today, he would be saying to you and to me, he would be asking this question: what is your passion in life? What is it that compels you? And what is it that drives you? Now, I know two men that had a great passion for something in their lives, that had fully invested hearts: Dick Bass and Frank Wells. They know what it's like to have something that overrides them, that gives them all of the energy and all of the power to overcome great obstacles in their lives. Their goal was to climb the 7 highest mountains in the world on the 7 great continents in 1 year. 1 year. You know the mountains, probably do. McKinley in North America, Aconcagua in South America, Elbrus in Europe. There was Kilimanjaro in Africa, Kosciuszko in Australia, Vinson in Antarctica, and of course, Mount Everest in Asia. And the kicker was, again, they wanted to do this in 1 year. Everest would be the most difficult because of its extreme altitude, 29,000 feet. They call it the death zone, where the cells in the body begin to die. Vinson would be the most severe in terms of the weather, of the harsh realities of Antarctica. And they wanted to do this in 1 year. No one had ever scaled all 7 summits of the great continents in 1 year. It would be a remarkable achievement, coveted by the world's greatest climbers in the world. It would take a major investment of their time, of their energy, and their money. You could call it their passion. Now, what makes this challenge even more remarkable is that Frank Wells was the president of Warner Brothers Studios, and Dick Bass was a Texas oil man and the owner of the Snowbird ski resort in Utah. What makes this so remarkable is that neither of them had ever climbed a mountain before. What makes this so remarkable is that they were both in horrible aerobic and physical conditioning. And then add on that now they were getting older and in their early 50s. They decided to take on this great achievement that had never been done before, that would take a fully invested heart of passion and an objective. Well, guess what? They did it. They did it. Not in 1 year. It took them 3 years. It took them 3 attempts to summit Everest alone, but they did it. A fully invested heart is a remarkable thing. Now, every single one of us has a heart that's invested in something, that has a burning passion about something. And that passion determines the direction of our lives and who we are and where we're headed and what kind of sacrifices that we're willing to make. It's what drives us. It's what gets us out of bed in the morning. It's what gives meaning and purpose to life. It's where we say, this is important to me. I could give my life to this. I could be devoted to it. It is my mountain peak in life. Now, interestingly, there was a man in the Bible who had a heart like this, a heart full of passion. He lived 3,000 years ago. And it was written of him by the prophet Samuel, these words in 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 14. For the Lord, that is God, sought out a man after God's own heart and appointed him prince of his people. A man who was seeking nothing but God's heart, that his heart was after God's heart. This man is a man by the name of David. He came absolutely out of nowhere. He was the youngest son of a large family business of shepherds. He was out in the fields watching the sheep. Ultimately, he ended up with more money and more status and more fame and more power than you could possibly imagine. But he found his ultimate meaning and purpose in life in his love for his God. As we said, his name was David. He lived 1,000 years before Jesus. He is the central character of the Old Testament. There is more written about David than there is about Abraham or Isaac or Jacob or Joseph or even Moses. He's the central character of the Old Testament. Jesus comes from the lineage of David, and he was called the Son of David. And to this day, this man's flag and his star on that flag hangs over the nation of Israel. And there are several things that make his heart unique. The first thing we notice about David is that he is a natural-born military leader and genius. At a very early age, he shocked the world by a first-round knockout of the reigning heavyweight champion, a man by the name of Goliath, with a single stone. At a very early age, when Saul the king said, "How can you, David, come here into battle amongst all of my warriors who are cowering and shaking at the voice of Goliath, including myself, and how can you say that you're willing to go down there into the valley and do battle with that giant?" And David said, "I'm a shepherd boy. I fight bears and I fight lions for a living. I'm watchful. I'm fiercely independent. I'm devoted to my sheep. I give my life for my sheep. I protect my sheep. And God has always protected me. And because I know he's always protected me, he'll protect me now, at this time." And then David trained 400 high-voltage warriors to follow him into battle. They were like Navy SEALs who could strike military objectives at a moment's notice. They were smart, they were shrewd, they were crafty. They had the heart of warriors. And over time, those 400 men grew into thousands of men who would fight for David at a moment's notice. They'd give their lives for him. You see, they said, "We'd rather die for David than to live without David." He was a born military genius and leader. His men loved him for his courage, for his passion, and for his heart. There's another thing you should know about this man, David. He was a world-class musician and poet. When it came to music, he was a child prodigy. When he was just a very young boy, Saul brought him into his court to comfort the king because Saul was going through these panic attacks and this anguish and this Angstvertungen. And David would play for him and sing to him, and his music would heal him. Have you ever noticed that music is a gift from God to our lives? Luther said it ministers to us and God this way and unites us between each other this way. That music has the ability in a heartbeat to change our emotions. You know, I can be driving along in the car and so intensely thinking about some problem that I'm going through, and all of a sudden this great song comes on the radio, and I start singing along with it, and my emotions are changed, and my heart is changed, and my soul is changed. Music has that gift, that power about it. When we do our Germany trips to the heart of the Reformation, the study of Martin Luther, we stay in a town called Weimar. It was the heart of the Weimar Republic. It's the cultural center of Germany. And we stay in this wonderful hotel. And one evening I have some musicians from the Bach Institute, which is centered in town, come in and play for us. And they play Bach and Beethoven and Wagner and Mozart. And in the middle of this, they play this one very sophisticated piece that is just filled with joy and power to it. But it's very, very sophisticated. And when they're done, they ask the question now, who do you suppose wrote that? And for some, they don't right away, it's the style of Mozart. Then they ask this question. At what age did he write that piece that you just heard? 9. 9 years old. Mozart was a child prodigy, and so was David. He could change a person's heart and mind and soul and emotions by his playing and by his singing. He could bring people into the very presence of God. And not only was he a great musician, but he was a great poet. Think about it. His book of the Psalms is the most well-read spiritual book in history. Its emotional depth is unparalleled. It ministers to people at our deepest levels of need. I can remember the summer when I was told that one of our friends, a young couple with 2 children, that the wife had come down with terminal cancer, it's not curable. 2 kids. And her goal was to make it through Christmas with her family. I remember calling Christmas week and saying to the husband and father, are you guys at all going to be able to make it to church? He said, no, we can't come to church for Christmas Eve. And so I went to the music team and I said, hey, after we're done with all these Christmas Eve services, I know you're planning on going home to be with your families, but you think we could take a moment to go over and visit this family and sing Christmas carols to them? And they said, absolutely. So we all went over after church, the last church service, and we sang them Christmas carols, hymns. And I shared a brief story about the shepherd boys. And then we read the Psalms. David is called the great psalmist of Israel. There is something about his psalms that ministers to our souls. David knows what it's like to have his heart broken, to cry out, to be lost in darkness and despair. He knows what it's like to search for sleep when there is no sleep. What life is like when we're surrounded by darkness. And those words bring comfort to us. He knows what it's like to teach us how to love God and to praise God and to worship God and to trust God and to follow God. He is the sweet psalmist of Israel. Well, there's something else that David was known for. He became famous for his sinfulness. When it was the height of his kingdom, when he's 30 years old, he ushered in what is called the golden age of Israel. He extended the borders, he established trade routes, he built great palaces, great cities. In Israel to this day, he is still referred to as the king. Although there were many other kings, but when you say the king, everyone knows who you're talking about. You're talking about David, the king. And then, at the height of his career, his story takes a strange turn. It was the spring of the year when kings went to war. The armies only fought in the spring and the summer and the fall, and then in the winter when the roads got all messed up and they couldn't travel, they came home. And then the next spring they went out again and engaged in their campaigns. And David had led his armies, his warriors, his soldiers every single year, but this year. And we're led to think there was a reason why the king stayed home. Because he was obsessed with a beautiful woman. And he had to have her. And he did. And his life changed. And to complicate matters, he abused his authority and had her husband killed in battle for him. Over time, his betrayal and this tragedy hit the front pages of every newspaper in Palestine. He was personally disgraced and publicly humiliated. His life was never again the same. And it's at this time, a year later, that Nathan confronts him, which we'll talk about in a couple messages. And David repents of his sin and owns his sin. And he cries out that beautiful 51st Psalm, the greatest prayer of confession ever written. Have mercy on me, O God. Have mercy on me, O God. According to thy steadfast mercies, according to thy amazing grace, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquities. What a prayer of the heart this man prays in the midst of his sin. And not only did he become famous for his sinfulness, but he was a broken-hearted father. You know how the story goes. The son and the father have words with each other. The son gets rebellious. The father gets frustrated and angry. They have words. Ultimately, in this story, the son leaves home and turns on his father, King David. And over time, the son, Absalom, becomes David's greatest enemy. He embarrasses him publicly for the nation of Israel. Well, during one of the battles, David's soldiers were pursuing the armies of Absalom, David's son. And when he was captured, one of his chief officers killed Absalom and made a beeline back to the capital, to the palace, to tell David, your worries, your problems are over, your son is dead. Only David didn't rejoice. His heart was broken. He loved his son Absalom. He loved him, no matter what. And he cries out in a brokenness that only a father could know. He cries out in 1 Samuel 18:33, "Oh, my son, Absalom, my son, Absalom. Would that I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." It's a cry, a pain, and a brokenness that only a father can know when he has lost a son that he loves. Oh, my son. Oh, my son. Oh, Absalom. Oh, Absalom. Would that I could have given my life instead of you. My son. My son. So not only is David a great military genius and a world-class musician, poet, famous for his sinfulness, not only is he a broken-hearted father, but through all of this, he overcomes. He becomes an overcomer because he never loses his heart and his passion for his God. In 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 7, we read these words. The Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. God looks on the heart, on the inner core. And God knew that for David ultimately had one thing that mattered and only one thing in his life, and that was his God. His God was his destiny. His God was his mountain peak. He had a fully invested heart and passion for God. He wasn't perfect. The Bible's full of stories of people who are not perfect. He was a real person living in a real world with real sin, but he knew he was living there with a real God. Just like you and me. He had gifts and strengths and talents. And he had failure and he had brokenness. And there were times when his life would absolutely unravel. David knew that he could fail God. But God would never fail him. He knew that he could fail God, but God could never fail him. Because God had his hand on his life. He held his life in his hand. God had a grasp on him. And he would not let go. And neither will he in your life and in my life. Life has all these twists and these turns to it. From a human perspective, it's complex, it's difficult, it's confusing. Sometimes it seems like God is not at work. That God doesn't work in straight lines, because he doesn't. God doesn't work in straight lines. God works in God's lines, in God's way, and in God's time. It's the doctrine of the providence of God. That beneath the surface of the visible world, of the world that we see, is the invisible hand of God. That's why the writers of Scripture say, walk by faith and not by sight, because sometimes by sight, our sight deceives us. Trusting God's providence at work in our lives. God may be silent to us, but he is never still. Never. We want plans and directions and the outcome, and we want to know that everything's going to be okay. But God is saying, before all of that happens, put your heart in me and trust me. For God, the starting point is a fully invested heart. A heart of failure, a heart of brokenness, a heart, a real beating heart. And once that's given, then God can use him. God can use this shepherd boy. The distinguishing mark of the life of David was that he always ended up in the right place. He always ended up, no matter what sin, no matter what brokenness, no matter what victory, he always ended up on his knees before his God. And I think the question for you and for me is that where we end up? In our victories, our successes, our failures, our brokenness, no matter what, do we end up on our knees before our God? Well, as we close, I want to read a passage from one of my favorite Psalms. It's the 42nd Psalm. David's hiding out from Saul in the caves of En-Gedi, and he sees a deer. He's in this dark cave, and there's a small brook or stream. You can visit it if you visit Israel. And David says these words when he sees that deer. He said, as the deer panteth and longs for flowing streams, so longs my soul for thee, O God. My soul thirsts for God. When shall I come and behold the face of God? He's hiding from Saul. His life is endangered. He is alone. But there's only one thing on his mind, that his soul longs and thirsts for God. And if David were here today, he would say to each one of us, where is your heart? Where is your passion? If I could give you one piece of advice, it's get sold out to God. Get obsessed. Godly obsessed. Get invested. Get sold out. Don't look back. Become an overcomer. I want a heart like that. I want a heart like that. I want a heart like that. A heart that overcomes. And it's my prayer that these messages will be a practical guide on how to overcome what faces us in life so that we can have that heart after God. So, assignment, get alone sometime today or this week and simply ask yourself the question, what is the passion of my heart? What is my desire? What is my mountain peak? What is my goal? What is my medal that I'm seeking after in life? And I suggest that that might be for all of us, that our hearts grow in passion and love this week for God, no matter what. Now, next, in our next message, I want to look at the obstacle that David had to overcome in his life was the obstacle of fear. I want to look at the root source of fear and then how we can overcome fear in our lives. And I hope you'll continue joining along on these messages.